We have a wonderful faculty that have put a lot of time into these presentations, and I think you'll enjoy them. So I'm actually going to get started and go forward, and I'm happy actually for people, for at least for my presentations and questions to even interrupt, but we will have some time for questions at the end as well. So just to sort of set the stage, it's interesting for me to give this talk because yesterday I gave a talk on the future, and these are sort of the other two pieces, the past and the present, but I think is a good basis to start. And just to go through where we've been with is this not working? No. Oh, okay. So we have just to break into actions. That's okay? Okay. Perfect. These are my disclosures again. This is sort of the outline for my presentation is really the timeline of OCT, and just this. It seems like it's been a long time, and I guess it depends on your perspective. But to me, it doesn't seem that long. 1991 was actually was a key pivotal point in sort of the change in how we practice ophthalmology, I suppose, with the first description of OCT. And many of you may remember the original science paper published by David Wong and Jim Fujimoto's lab, and this is animal eye that they had to image for 20 minutes actually, and actually I'm sorry, an eye bank eye, the image for extended period of time, 20 minutes per image frame, and the first sort of OCT image published, and sort of really kind of highlighted the potential for OCT as a non-invasive technique for cross-sectional imaging. And I did want to explain a little bit about the technology, because I actually always find it's important to understand the technology, to understand good disease interpretation. But it's based on a principle called optical ranging, which basically means that information about distance and the like regarding various ocular structures is extracted from time delays and reflected signals. I found it very interesting that OCT was not the first application. Many of you may be interested to know that the first application was actually in testing out fiber optics. It was the same kind of technique, looking at the delay to find reflections to sort of figure out where the defect or fault was in these fiber optic lines, which is kind of interesting. But in any event, we many times draw the analogy of OCT to ultrasound, and it is a good analogy. It's analogous to ultrasound, except you're using light instead of sound. But the challenge with OCT, of course, in contrast to ultrasound, where you're measuring sound, time delays of sound, it's very difficult to do that directly with light, because obviously light travels very fast. And so in order to actually assay this time delay, you actually have to use these interferometric detection techniques. And that's why interferometer is such a key component. And in fact, in order to take advantage of this interferometric techniques to actually look for evidence of constructive or destructive interference, you really have to have a low coherence type of light source. And that actually is what dictates the type of light sources we have available for OCT imaging. So just to walk you through this original OCT description, how do these devices work? Well, of course, in order to be able to do OCT, as I said, you had to have a low coherence light source. In the beginning, we started with these sort of near-infrared type of light sources. And this light goes through essentially a 50-50 splitter via fiber optics. And half of the light goes to this so-called sample arm, basically to the retina via the optics of the device. And the other half goes to the reference arm, which actually, in the case of time-domain OCT, features a mirror, that I'll explain in a moment. It's a moving mirror. So reflection events happen in both sides, and then they come back, and the reflected light ultimately gets back to the detector, where it combines either constructively or destructively, depending on differences in the path length. So that's how you get the reference distance. And ultimately, by moving the mirror, you're able to look at a variety of different depths, and based on where the mirror is, you get a variety of different types of interferograms. And ultimately, the bottom line is there's complicated processing that occurs in order to get your depth information. The key thing to know is that there is not a single reflection in the retina. There are multiple surfaces in the retina. Wherever you have an index of refraction change, you have a reflection event that occurs. And so because you have these multiple different events, you're able to get information about the depth of a variety of different structures in the eye. And each reflecting layer will generate a type of interferogram, which then can be demodulated by the software. And so if you look at several points, again, you can get your A scan by moving the mirror back and forth to know your depth, but if you put them together, you can essentially construct a B scan.
And that's sort of the basic principle of time-domain OCT. Again, the key feature is the mirror has to move in order to get your depth information. And so if you wanted, if you acquired one place, you've got to move the line to another part of the retina, with your tip-tilt mirror here, and acquire another A-scan. And so it's a kind of a time-consuming process, as you can see, in terms of acquiring the OCT information. So again, it's not surprising that when they first tried to develop it, it took so long to acquire an image. But that probably isn't really something that's going to be appropriate for use in the clinical space. So it took a few years as ICID licensed the patents for the technology. And so 1996, late 1996, was actually the first commercial OCT device. And you can see an OCT1 device from the Zeiss archives. And this device featured an axial resolution of about 15 microns, which is not very impressive. 100 A scans per second, not too fast, but that's where we were at. And it was pretty amazing still. And these are some of the original papers that Carmen and the group with Jim Fujimoto had published using this device. It really wasn't ready for prime time, probably. There were a lot of sales of OCT1, let me put it that way. It was also ergonomically challenged, I might add. So in 2000, there was an important update with the second commercial OCT device, the OCT2. It didn't really improve a lot in terms of its scanning speed, but certainly the ergonomics were more tolerable for a clinical environment. It's actually really a key device because I think it really established the potential benefits of OCT. Certainly people were recognizing vitreomacular interface disease that they didn't appreciate on biomicroscopy, unless of course you were Don Gass, then you could appreciate these types of things. But certainly it helped in terms of defining the applications of OCT, or at least sort of whetting people's appetite. But where really the game changer, really the device that really changed everything, I think, 2002, the availability of the Stratus OCT. You can see sort of the improvement on the same patient in this nice paper in the VJO, explaining that when you were able to improve the axial resolution as well as the scanning speed, you really could get good imaging of the retina, and sort of the disease applications really exploded, whether it was still vitreomacular interface disease, but now macular edema and even choroidal devascularization. But I think what was really the most amazing thing about OCT, which really changed ophthalmology when you think about where we were in the fluorescein world, was this concept of automated quantitative data. It's really something that we didn't have. And you think back and think, wow, our field has really changed. And even this concept of disease progression analysis, we all use these kinds of, I don't really practice glaucoma, but these kind of disease progression analyses maps are really pretty exciting. And we thought that OCT is a great tool now to be able to precisely monitor patient progress and response to therapies. And so it's not surprising that OCT began to be included as an important secondary outcome measure in clinical trials and even used for eligibility determinations. So this was really great. OCT really took off. We did a PubMed search during that time. You'd see almost thousands of papers coming out utilizing OCT. The next big game-changing event was, of course, in 2006, and this was the introduction of the first commercial spectral domain OCT device. We were fortunate. We started working with these STO devices back in 2005. But in any event, I pointed out to how one of the real challenges with time-domain OCT is that each A-scan had to be accumulated over a period of time, because you had to have a mirror move back and forth that reflected the depth information of the retina. So the great advantage with the spectral domain OCT, of course, is that you'll see here the mirror does not move at all. And instead you're using the spectral, essentially a spectrometer diffraction grating to be able to get the depth information. It was really a great advance. And certainly that improved the speed. Again, the mirror doesn't move, as you can see in this illustration. And so each of these A-scans are acquired, animated too fast there, but each A-scan is acquired all at once, and that really improved the speed. And so that has many advantages. I mean, using a spectrometer, no moving parts, gives you better speed, as I'll illustrate, but it also improved the sensitivity. And again, these devices also featured broader bandwidth light sources, which means higher resolution, because many of you know that the resolution of an OCT device is very much dependent on the bandwidth, and the time-domain OCT Stratus OCT is about 20 nanometer bandwidth. Almost all of the RSDOCT instruments operate at least 50 nanometers of bandwidth, and of course, there's a few, not just Jim Fujimoto's Thai sapphire lasers, but for example, some of the old optical devices actually use superplexed, multiplexed SLDs that could achieve that same type of bandwidth. And it does matter, as we've all come to learn, because it certainly improves our identification of the fine outer retinal structures. We actually, we whenever you're a reading center person, you like to measure these things precisely. So we did this study where we said, I pointed out, I think yesterday, that the external limiting membrane is a great benchmark that we use when we assess the quality of systems. So we did a study where we simply traced out every single pixel, every A scan, where we could see the external limiting membrane. And this is too small to read, but it says time domain OCT here, and it's an SD-OCT on this side. And basically, if you're falling on this side of the line, that means that you're seeing a greater percentage of the ELM with the spectral domain compared to the time domain. This is not so clinically important per se, except to say that we needed to have a measure of quantifying the gain that we were seeing with the technology. Now, higher sensitivity is, I think, it's not just a trivial thing. I really made the argument about swept source yesterday and how sensitivity is one of its big calling cards. And I can't emphasize how important sensitivity is. People so fixate on resolution and forget about this. And so here's a nice illustration of the same patient. It's not exactly the same cut, obviously, but imaged with a time-domain Stratus OCT, and this is an early prototype spectrum OCT device. And notice this portion here behind the posterior hyaloid. You can see that the signal here is very similar, these two spaces, and that's really related to the sensitivity of the signal. And here you can see there is a qualitative difference between the formed vitreous and the preretinal space, and just an illustration of where sensitivity and signal-to-noise ratio makes a difference. And of course, that's what allows you to get much better vitreous rendering with spectral domain devices. Here's, we've come to learn about vitreous schisis. We see sometimes one of the reasons why we're often fooled in thinking there's even a PVD on OCT is because multiple different layers of the vitreous that can now be discerned. So that higher sensitivity is great, but one of the caveats that I pointed out yesterday as well is that remember that spectrum OCT is really sensitive as you're close to the zero delay, which usually is set to the vitreous side. It's the whole concept of why enhanced depth imaging came out to be, which is basically to say let's move the sensitivity, the most sensitive side towards the choroidal side of things. But the point is that there's this fall off, and again, one of the key advantages of the swept source technology. And then, the other major advantage we've talked about a little bit is higher speed. Just as a reminder, Stratus OCT, 400 scans per second. This is sort of the spectral domain realm. And with the newer devices, swept source OCTs, most of the initial commercial releases are coming out at the bottom end of the spectrum in terms of 100,000 A scans per second, but still devastatingly fast. And why does it matter? And again, asked to do this kind of introduction, and so we kind of all inherently, I think, recognize this, but maybe it's important to point out what do we really gain in moving to spectrum OCT, and certainly denser scanning is an important advantage, so we're used to now getting these kinds of volume scans. I don't know about the rest of you, I can't live without my volume scans now. It's the way I conceive or think about OCT imaging, and of course we recognize there are many advantages, obviously, right? I mean, if you have segmentation errors and you're doing time-domain OCT, those are propagated over large areas. It's kind of a problem when you're not really measuring things in detail, and of course, if you have small lesions, you could miss them. And we always like to show this case of a patient of mine who has a wrapped lesion, which we didn't detect. We couldn't see this on the Stratus OCT. It's a really relatively small event here where you can see the communication to this PVP in this patient. Now this is an image collected with the 2005 early prototype device. Not too. All the times we're going to go a little longer because we've got time, but one of the talks is not going to be given. But what's that?
Spectral, not time.
This is spectral domain, but this is an early prototype device in 2005. But even here, you can see as it went by the defect of this patient with unexplained vision loss. We couldn't figure out what was going on. Otherwise, the fluorescein looked fine in this patient, and we could see this subtle type of defect. So these are small things that can easily be missed if you're not imaging these areas. This patient who we're treating with ranibizumab, we really couldn't spot any subretinal fluid. There's a little sub-RP fluid you can see there. But it was very interesting. The same patient, when we got the spectrum OCT, we could easily see that there's a fluid pocket there. It's just missed. We just happened to not catch it on the B scans that we obtained. And in fact, we characterized this in another study that's been published, that you miss fluid in about 10% of cases for spectral domain versus, or time domain versus spectral domain OCT. And there are many other benefits, in terms of surgical planning that you can get with these kind of, skip forward just in the interest of time. Another advantage is, I think, in terms of really noticing, knowing where what I call the true RP baseline. So here's a patient who referred to me. The glaucoma specialist wanted to know, in a simple question, does this patient have hypotony maculopathy? And the answer here is, you can't tell, because this was time domain OCT, and this kind of undulation, the baseline, regularly occurred. So in contrast, if I obtain a spectrum OCT on this patient, can I be sure this is hypotony maculopathy? Absolutely, because I know that these folds are real. In fact, if I show you the volume scan of this patient, you can see the undulation is just scrolling through. You can see that they're not projecting so well, but the folds there, and of course after this patient had a revision of their filter, the folds did in fact resolve. Averaging is another important benefit. Speckle noise is a major problem in ST-OCT systems, and it's what degrades the image quality. If you average multiple B scans in the same location, you can improve that. Many of you have seen this nice simulation from the Spectralis device where they show how averaging B scans can improve the quality of the images. It's really nice, especially when you're interested in studying outer retinal abnormalities. Registration, this is probably one of the biggest benefits, and this was a real challenge at time in OCT. This was a test we did on a subject actually could see pretty well, but you can see this is their eye moving around as they were getting scanned with the Stratus OCT, so you can imagine that that can create some problems. The nice thing with spectrum OCT, even the older devices which didn't feature tracking, now almost all the devices are tracking capable, but even then we had invariant landmarks that we could use to facilitate registration over time. I always like to show this is a case we put in the DRCR trial. It had to be over 250 or 300 microns to get into the study. We just scanned the patient a minute later and you can see magically they measured over 300 microns. So these kinds of things we saw all the time, right? And so we got this patient into the study. Probably shouldn't have gone in, but anyway. I didn't see, in fairness, I didn't see the other scan. The photographer got the other one. What's that? I know. See, it just shows you how where we've come. That's talking about where we came from. So even though I'm taking the director's liberty of going over because we have the extra talk time. So in any event, another advantage is improved segmentation. We published on how frequent these segmentation errors were with time of OCT. In fact, the problem is it's not disappeared, obviously, with spectrum OCT, but it is much less. I mean, many people use maps and things to follow patients, and really, even this patient with poor signal, you can see that they do a pretty good job with segmenting, especially some of them. Cirrus does a really good job, as it turns out, but even it can fail in complex cases. But the point is that when you have the benefit of adjacent B scans, you really can, manufacturers use this to facilitate the quality of their segmentation. So I think the biggest advantage, though, we have the spectrum of OCT is we finally have competitors. So we have all these manufacturers put together a summary sort of table of the devices out there. We all have. I mean, the reality is they're all pretty good, and there are differences in terms of some of the accessory technologies and capabilities they have. But the reality is there are differences in software, which are probably the more important ones in my opinion. But the reality is they all do a pretty good job. Okay, so lastly, and I'm going to be finished with this talk now, I just mentioned the other huge landmark event. I just recently was availability in 2012 of the first commercial swept source devices. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I talked about this at length yesterday. Remember, there's a speed improvement, but also, more importantly, I think, a sensitivity improvement. So you're able to scan these huge areas, get these megapixel type of fundus images, huge B scans that span the fovea and the optic nerve head, and of course you can do very dense volume scans, which are great for producing these kind of megapixel OCT fundus images, which I think are going to be very transformative moving forward. And I showed this case yesterday with the Cirrus PV as well that we had imaged, and then diving down into the choroid. Excuse me, and also imaging through a patient with CMV. I don't want to belabor that point, just to emphasize it's nice that we're now at this point in terms of our capabilities with OCT. And of course, there's also an anterior. This is the only commercially released posterior segment swept source device so far. The images I've been showing you have not been from this device; they're from another pre-release device, which I can't name. But the point is that multiple companies will be releasing these instruments, so we'll have an opportunity to get hold of them. So in summary, OCT is now the core imaging diagnostic technology in ophthalmology. I think that, and I'll try to make the case in my next talk, that understanding the technology and having this background is pretty important, I think, for being confident in interpretation. With that, I'll stop this one. Excuse me. And actually, I actually have the next talk as well, so I'm going to go straight on to that. Oh, thank you. Just dry there. So you can go ahead and pull my second. Any questions on this one while I'm just waiting for the second talk? We'll take questions at the end too. Okay. So can you launch it? Great. Okay, so Colin, in putting together this nice program, asked me to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of reading spectrum OCT. So we go through some of this stuff with our graders. This is not the same presentation I give to the graders as part of their training program at the Reading Center, but something similar. So in any event, getting to my disclosures again. But basically, I think that there's some keys to success if you want to become a good OCT interpreter. And so one thing is you actually need to know something about retinal histology and histopathology. That's important. You need to know what normal is, because you're going to have a heck of a time trying to interpret disease without knowing what's normal. And then you've got to always remember that you're dealing with light and its wave properties. So we're talking about, you're not really necessarily imaging a specific structure, you're imaging interfaces and reflections. You have to also remember, because you're dealing with light, that there are issues of attenuation or shadowing that you have to consider in your interpretation. I'll show you examples of all of that. And of course, there's always important to consider image quality and the possibility of artifacts. And I will illustrate all of this in the next 10 minutes. So again, these are from some nice publications where they tried to line up the histology with the OCT. And even Phil and I were having some nice discussions. And so there's difficulty in achieving consensus on these things, as I'll point out. But there's some basic facts that probably most people accept, that the nerve fiber layer, the RPE, and some of the outer segment bands can be highly reflective, whereas the plexiform layers of the ELM kind of have an intermediate reflectivity. The nuclear layers in the vitreous have low reflectivity, and Henle's fiber layer has a variable reflectivity. It can be dark or bright. So I put an X here because we don't use this system anymore, although Phil will argue that he'd like to keep that system, I think. So this is sort of so I put this slide up very briefly. I'll go over it in a little bit more detail because this was what was agreed to. And Giovanni and I had run a consensus OCT meeting about a year ago. But it's taken about a year finally to get the paper, even though we had achieved consensus during the course of this meeting. We had a panel, I think about 30 people, Giovanni, who came to the meeting we invited, who were OCT experts. Not everyone could make it, unfortunately, so that's why it's always a challenge. But we were able to drive to consensus on several points. And so just to highlight again, nerve fiber layer, ganglion cell layer, interplexiform layer, internuclear layer, outer plexiform layer, all that's pretty standard. Again, Henle's fiber layer, you can see that it's kind of dark here. Actually, it's bright for a portion there, and it's kind of dark. And maybe some of you, even though this projector is not projecting it perfectly, you might be able to see that there's a subtle evidence of an interface. It's interesting that in many cases, Henle's fiber layer can be darker than an outer nuclear layer. You can actually pick it up in that. You can barely detect that kind of interface there. Then the external limiting membrane. And this is sort of the bone of many people's contention. So the negotiated solution, even though many people may not be happy, the negotiated solution for that band, which used to be called the ISOS junction, some say that it should still be called the ISOS junction, but anyway, it was negotiated to ellipsoid zone. The black space in between was negotiated to be the myoid zone. And the reason you might say, oh, why did you come up with zones? That's crazy. Well, it's because, there was the only way to get consensus. People felt very strongly about it. We know that generally those objects are there. I don't know exactly where they are. So the zone is a term that's used as a placeholder to reflect that uncertainty. It could be revised at future times. And then this band here is the interdigitation zone, which people used to call the cost line. So that's its new term. And then the RPE band, and then there's other choroidal layers. Okay, so in any event, the protocol for reading STOCT scans. So one thing that we usually advise is that we don't recommend using the thickness maps alone. And that's, of course, I already made the case about segmentation errors. But I would say that map failures aren't always obvious. Look at this patient I treated with anti-VEGF therapy, and it was immediately clear. It looked like something got better. Maybe I wasn't sure that there was I thought maybe this patient got better. But actually, this is the underlying OCT data for this patient. And you can see that what happened here was that on one time, the algorithm detected this as the bottom, and one time it went over the RPE. These kinds of things can happen. And so this is a challenge if you're only using the map of being, what is your ability to detect these types of events. So we actually studied this. We had a study, unfortunately never published, it's just at ARVO that we presented this, but it was a former medical retina fellow of mine. It was this nice study, 80 visits that we looked at patients, basically specifically looked at patients who were deemed to be dry. And then we looked at their next visit to see, could we tell that they now had picked up some new fluid. Okay, that was sort of the setting there. And we looked for the usual suspects of fluid. And we did sort of ground truth grading, looking at all 128 B scans of the cube. Okay, and that was a mass assessment. And then we just looked at the map. And the map was very insensitive for picking up new fluid in these patients. Now, when we added the 5-line rasters, the sensitivity improved, but still it wasn't great. In fact, if you really wanted to go over the 90% sensitivity, I'll show you, you really have to look at several more scans. So how many do you need to review? And how dense should your scanning protocol be? So we actually did another study, it was published, I think a year or two ago. But basically what we did is we did dense scans on patients, and we did grading for the presence of fluid. And then we sort of started to eliminate half the scans and represented them to graders in a mass fashion. They didn't know what was what, and said, is there fluid? And we kept doing this elimination kind of study. We took out scans. We just wanted to see when did you start missing stuff. Okay, so if ever you can understand that study design. And basically what we found was if you want to be 90% sensitive, again, does it matter? I don't know, but if you really want to not miss fluid, then it seemed like you had to do more than 32B scans because the sensitivity seemed to drop off. And so that's how we concluded. So we always get more, we usually get at least 64B scans when we are evaluating patients with choroidal vascularization as a result. Okay, so my recommendation certainly is that you should review the entire volume stand. I think you should implement systems in your practice environment to make this possible, because the challenge is we're seeing lots of patients. How do you make it happen? I think it's possible, but you have to have the right image management system and things employed. And there are other benefits as well, because review adjacent, I've learned so much by reviewing my volume scans, and there's certainly ambiguous features that can be confusing. Like, for example, anybody else, what is this? I just show you a single B scan. What's that? Anybody know? Any ideas? Okay, so I'll just make a point. It's hard to know without context, right? So, so we don't really know. But if I show you this, what do you think this is now? This is the scrolling B scan, that same case, and you can see, we actually call this the jumping fish sign. You can see how they're moving across there. You can see that. You see that? It's kind of cool. Right? But actually, jumping fish is sign. This was a term coined by my colleague Alex Walsh, just really to highlight how you really couldn't interpret this if you just had a single B scan. Of course, these are dry retinal folds. It's been described now, it's published. I think somebody else published this after we described it, but these are dry retinal folds after repair of magnetotic attachment. Very difficult to discern if you didn't look at that. So then, as I said, I like to be very systematic in terms of my assessment. I like to look at the reflectivity of the layers, as well as thickness, continuity, and surface contour. I'll give you some examples. This is an example of a situation where you have increased brightness here. What is the diagnosis here? Because I think many of these, you can just make the diagnosis based on the OCT alone. Any ideas? In fact, there's a couple of things this could be. Yes, that's right. Dr. Rosenfeld is correct. The increased brightness and thickness of the inner retinal layers restricted to that, so the diagnosis is an acute ceria. So there really is nothing else that looks like. I mean, I guess if it wasn't so thick, it could be Tay-Sachs disease, but you know, really, it's a pretty easy diagnosis. Here's a situation of increased brightness, and of course, you know, you can see that there are also some other abnormalities here in the ERM and the like. So the question I have is, what is this hyperreflective material? Anybody? So this is again where context, of course, is important. And here I see that there's retinal edema and the like, and so I can interpret this as being lipid. Now, in contrast, look at this patient. There's also hyperreflective material in the retina. So what is this? Pigment, very good. So that's right. So again, you see the same kind of finding, but the point is that you see what's around you. Now you see that there is drusenoid pigmental attachments. I know this is pigment migration. That's exactly right. So context is a very key component of your interpretation. What about this? I thought I put this in especially for Giovanni, because we saw all these cases here, right? This must be a polypoidal lesion, correct? Obviously it's not, because, and I have ICGs that know this is not, in fact, this patient. So it's not, and so there's several clues. I mean, Giovanni already pointed out it's unusual to have this kind of cystoid change. And you also see hyperreflective features. It almost looks like the retina's diving down into this lesion. This, of course, is, you know, when you see a PED, surface discontinuities in the PED, and this hyperreflectivity in the retina associated with CME, that is pretty consistent with a RAP lesion, which is what this patient had confirmed on ICG. Okay, and again, you know, I was just going to point out, there's also lesions of decreased brightness, history of edema in this patient. Of course, you have subretinal fluid and sub-RP fluid, nice examples of those things. What about this patient? This patient has retinal thinning. What's the diagnosis here? Anybody? It's pretty diagnostic, too. There's only two possibilities, actually. So the key thing I'd point out to you is it's not just nerve fiber layer loss, it's inner retinal loss, the outer retina is completely intact. So you know it's either an ischemic branch retinal vein occlusion or a branch retinal artery occlusion. Turns out this patient actually is a patient with Susak syndrome, had a pretty severe ischemic, had a branch retinal artery occlusion, as you can see. But again, the key is you can see, look at what layers are lost. And that you can make so many diagnoses just on the OCT alone. This is a patient with cystoid edema associated with a CRVO. Here's an assessment. Another thing I look at, not just thickness and brightness, but also discontinuities. You can see that the outer retinal bands are missing here. So the diagnosis here is preservation centrally, loss of outer retinal bands in the peripheral margin of the scan. It's probably going to be retinal degeneration. This patient has retinal sphygmomatosis. So you also have a little clue with little cystoid changes there as well. So I would say 90% of the diagnosis you can make with this in many cases. Again, I agree, of course, I don't want to make our multimodal advocates, because I'm also a multimodal advocate, upset, because you still need to get the other 10%. But in any event, again, deformations, elevations is something we always look for these kind of surface contours, and of course, always look at the reflectivity internally of these structures, because you can see these are typical examples of drusenoid PD with homogeneous, medium internal reflectivity, cirrus PD, homogeneous, low reflectivity, and then a fibrovascular PED where you can see the vascular channels and this set of intermediate type of reflectivity. And the last couple of steps, I always consider confounders whenever I interpret something. Before I conclude that some abnormality is an abnormality, I would say, could I be getting fooled? So for example, like here, I mean, did this patient completely lose their outer retinal bands? I don't know, because there's clearly shadowing from all the lipids. I would make that conclusion. I've intentionally picked this example, but this is an example of a patient. It's not projecting very well, but it's not actually a good OCT anyways. That's the point. And here's a patient. Did they lose their outer retinal layers? No. I mean, this patient's so massively thick that you lost signal and you can't tell. So I would make any conclusion on such a patient. Is the external membrane disrupted? This is actually my eye. So I hope the answer is that it's not disrupted. But the point is that this is an issue of quality. This is a scan that's obtained far from the zero delay line. You can see you can't see it anymore. In fact, when we scan closer to it, we teach our photographers, unless I'm interested in something specific in the vitreous, they know to put the scan up close to zero delay line because I want to have optimal quality. That's how you get it. And so again, that's an important thing to remember, is where that scan is positioned, where was the zero delay, and that affects your interpretation. Yes, question? Well, there is information in the save file that tells you that there is a way you can tell on some of the menus. It varies from machine to machine, so you're going to have to ask your machine manufacturer. But usually you can tell. Many of them will present it inverted to you that the zero delay lines have been switched. But you can also tell because if you start to see a big trail off of signal into the choroid, you know it's been oriented on that choroid side. Okay, so this is anyways one of the reasons why we use enhanced depth techniques. All right, the last thing is, could it be an artifact? Yes?
Backtrack one slide for a second. Many of our young and healthy patients have that hard exudate right in the foveola, that highly reflective, and with no drop of vision. Can you discuss that for a second?
Well, so you're asking what is the cause of that, and obviously it has. And you can see also, I would also point out to you that the ILM is also brighter right here, and a lot of this is related to the incident light effect, right? So this surface doesn't create the same bright effect. I would argue the brightness here is probably pretty similar to the brightness here, and it all relates to the perpendicular contact point there, and that's a big index of refraction change. Any significant index of refraction change is likely to produce a bright signal on OCT. But I don't think that there is. I mean, I hope this is my eye. So when you're pointing out that I have a disease there, Ethan, it is concerning to me. So
we use that when training technicians as a way to try to get them to find the actual center of the fovea where to put the scan, to look for that reflective hotspot.
Yes.
As an indicator for a properly placed scan.
Yeah, so it's obviously good. I mean, now people are talking about doing directional OCT, Brandon Lujan in particular, in order to be able to tell. Because here, obviously, I don't know exactly. This scan's not. This is again a scan that's not a sufficient quality to resolve that interface between at least fiber layer. In fact, we see. I mean, you can see different OCT devices. Some of them we might inherently think, oh, it's a great quality scan, but I mean, if you really care about scan quality, you can see that you're missing information here. I don't see that subtle demarcation that I showed you before. So one of the things you could do is you could do a directional OCT, and by changing the angle of incidence, just how you need to have the patient look a little bit off center or go into the pupil instead of going in the center, go into the pupil slightly eccentrically. You can teach your operators to do this very easily. And yes, then you'll lose this, Ethan, but you may gain other things. So the key thing is think about what you're trying to image and have them orient the zero delay to there. Now, once we get to Web services, none of this will matter. Okay, so I need to move on. Because we have many other, much better talks coming up. So So in any event, why does this patient, is this real? Does this patient have a dimple in their huge, massive cyst? Obviously, they don't, because otherwise I wouldn't be showing it, right? So this is a patient, I scanned them in a different spot, just move the image down, and then suddenly the dimple undimpled, right? Looks pretty good. And obviously what happened here is the so-called conjugate image artifact. We see it most in patients who are myopes. Remember with STOCT, we acquired two images actually. We have the mirror image. In fact, a lot of times when we're doing enhanced depth imaging, we're really bringing the mirror image into view of sorts. And so this is a problem when you have diseases that span huge lengths on the sensor. And so, again, we adjust the Z offset to bring this into view. But if you have huge structures that span big areas, then you can get this type of an overlapping effect. And that's what happened in that case. So you had that weird dimple as a result of that type of an effect. This is just to show you how the retina inverted so the volume scan of the patient, just because you had the conjugate image appearing in the view sometimes and the like. So keep that in mind. And different STOC devices handle this in different ways. This is one of my favorite things, and this is where, I once had a resident came to me and said, "Oh, this patient's got this horrible disease in the choroid," and this, of course, said, "Oh, what is this?" Yeah, this is asteroid hyalosis, and this is from the conjugate image reflected onto this side. And that's something you always have to, and again, here they said "Oh, what is this patient has got?" And I was told that they said, "Is this patient Dusen? Is there a worm?" As we're going to see here, it goes into the retina. I said, "No, the patient does not have a worm going through their retina. It's just the conjugate image artifacts, the vitreous on the other side coming through." So always consider the possibility of artifact. So anyway, I will stop by saying the accurate reading of STOCT images really, I think, requires understanding of the technical attributes of the technology. That's why I took some pains to go through that. And a recognition of normal retinal anatomy and being systematic in your approach in considering these issues. So with that, I will stop. And any other last minute questions? Otherwise, I'm turning over the program. Who am I turning over the program next to, Colin? Who's the next speaker? I'm sorry. I closed the workshop program. Any questions while I'm flipping to the right? Page here. Go. Okay, well, we'll have quite time for questions at the end as well.